Hi, everybody. Brianna Whitney here, host of True Crime AZ Live. Thanks so much for joining us this week. It has been a crazy week in terms of trials and big cases that I think a lot of you probably know about or know these names. And we're going to get into that in just a second here. But I first want to thank everybody who joined us last week for the premiere of our documentary, Obsessed, Unraveling Jodi Arias. And then we did a special episode of True Crime AZ Live where we did this big Q&A with my photographers and editors, and our own Derek Stahl kind of moderated that and asked us questions. And a lot of you guys joined. A lot of people watched the premiere of the documentary live and then joined us for that Q&A. And I so thank everybody who participated and wrote in questions, everything like that. If you haven't seen Obsessed, Unraveling Jodi Arias, we're going to put a link in the description here in this show so you can go and check it out on YouTube. And then if you're a podcast person, we've got the podcast that's unfolding. The first episode already came out on True Crime Arizona. The second episode is dropping on Monday. So there's a lot more to it as well. If you watch the documentary and you want to learn more, got way more interviews, way more information. So I want to thank everybody for that. But let's get into the cases for this week, starting with one that everybody loves, Luigi Mangione, the guy that is suspected of killing the United Healthcare CEO. That is segment one tonight, the big case. All right, so Luigi Mangione is actually back in court this week. It was about a year ago that he was suspected of killing Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO. And typically, before you get to an actual trial, there are hearings, and usually those last maybe a couple hours, maybe a day if it's intense and it's something that's really, really specific and important. But this hearing is actually lasting the entire week. Well, why? Because his defense team is arguing that crucial and key evidence should be tossed out based on two different factors. One, they claim that when Luigi Mangione was arrested in a McDonald's in Pennsylvania last year, that one, he was not read his Miranda rights, and two, that they did not have a search warrant to go through his backpack. What was in that backpack was pretty damning evidence. This included items that they seized, which was a gun with a 3D printed receiver, ammunition, and a red handbook that prosecutors say had incriminating writings in it that even detailed certain dates and plans that he had. So it's very interesting. This is also a case that spans both federal and state charges. Mangione has pleaded not guilty to 9 state charges, including murder, and he faces federal charges that could carry the death penalty. So who was in court testifying this week, and what are we looking at? Well, there were some officers that testified about when Luigi Mangione was arrested in that McDonald's. There were also security camera workers that also testified in court this week. And you can see these are actually pictures from Luigi in court this week. He was granted wearing a normal outfit, normal suit. He did not have to show up shackled or in an orange jumpsuit that he would be obviously in while he is staying in jail ahead of trial. We don't have a trial date yet because all of this stuff has to get hammered out before we can get to that point. Of course, this case has been very polarizing. He has so many supporters. They said that Luigi Mangione has received 6,000 letters in jail. That is an absurd amount. And there were people lining the streets of New York, spending the night to try to get into the courtroom to watch this hearing live or just outside supporting him. He's really become this kind of martyr for people who are against the healthcare industry, and they feel that free Luigi is kind of the clause in the statement that people are saying. So he's got, honestly, possibly more supporters, loud supporters at least, than anything else. And you can see the video here of that moment that Luigi allegedly shot and killed Brian Thompson. So where does this get us? Because if you're talking about crucial evidence in the case like this, you really would need this to be able to prove that he did kill and murder Brian Thompson beyond a reasonable doubt. So is it likely the evidence will get tossed out or not? I want to bring in criminal defense attorney Russ Richelsoph. Russ and I have worked together for many years here in Arizona. Obviously, Russ not affiliated with the case, but I do appreciate you going through some of the defense motions and everything today to study up for our interview tonight. I know this is a big
You're
one.
welcome.
Thank you. So let's just actually, I mean, before we even get into everything that happened and what the likelihood is, I mean, what is it about this case that you think has people so interested and supporting somebody who is likely going to face a first-degree murder charge and the death penalty?
Well, I don't think it hurts that many people find the defendant attractive. I
Yeah.
know people. Shout out to my assistant Callie, who have a crush on Luigi Mangione. Um, so I think that plays a factor into it. Anytime you have an attractive defendant in a case, whether it's a male defendant or a female defendant, it just makes it better TV, better media. So I think that aspect of the case is one of the reasons. I think the other thing too is that a lot of people just have frustrations with healthcare in the United States, and I think this act that he's alleged to have committed is kind of touched off on some people. And I think he has a lot of supporters, not because people support murder, but because they support changes in healthcare in the United States.
Sure. So, I mean, all eyes have been on this, and way more eyes on a preliminary hearing than we would typically see before you get to a trial, even in a high profile case. So, let's talk about what's at stake here. Should the officers have gotten a warrant to search his backpack and seize those items? And does it change if it's a manhunt situation where they are actively looking for somebody that they think is dangerous?
So the short answer is, should they have gotten a warrant? Yes, they should have gotten a warrant. Um, what's interesting about this case is we're dealing with 3 different jurisdictions. So there's criminal cases in New York, there's criminal cases in Pennsylvania, and then there's criminal cases in U.S. District Court. And so you're dealing with 3 different jurisdictions and 3 different sets of law. So things that may not be admissible in New York and Pennsylvania may be admissible in federal court. So you could have a situation where state court judges make certain rulings, but then those rulings don't have any effect in federal court.
Okay, so what would that mean then for the protocol? I guess my question on that then is, let's say that a judge finds that they should have gotten a search warrant and that he should have been read his Miranda rights. Does that breach of protocol supersede the evidence that was found? I mean, the evidence was overwhelming that he likely did this, but does protocol come number 1, and would that discredit that?
So in the United States, we have something called the exclusionary rule. So when police officers violate a defendant's constitutional rights in order to obtain evidence, the penalty for that is the evidence is precluded. It's kept out of the case. The prosecutors are not allowed to use the evidence. Why is that? Because that is, U.S. Supreme Court determined that was the best remedy for this type of situation, because it creates an incentive for police departments to follow the law. If they're gathering evidence illegally and it can't be used in court, it's kind of pointless. So it encourages police agencies to follow the law and gather evidence in a way that's lawful.
If it was determined that they cannot go forward with this evidence due to that, I mean, that would be a huge blow to the prosecution, would it not?
So with regards to the search, I did have an opportunity to read the defense motions with regards to their arguments regarding the search. The prosecutor's motions I couldn't find, so they weren't available. But there's the fact pattern that's laid out in the defense motions is a bit more specific than what I've seen in the newspaper and TV stories about the case. Essentially, Luigi was contacted by the police. He was sitting in a McDonald's. He was eating a steak McMuffin, which I didn't know was a thing. But he's contacted by the police. Pretty soon, more police officers show up. And according to his defense attorneys, they create this wall of police officers. So there's one patrol officer who seems to be in charge, and he's directing the other patrol officers to kind of line up and position themselves in a way so that Luigi Mangione can't leave the McDonald's. Um, the defense argues this because it's important to establish whether or not a reasonable person would feel free to leave. Um, in this particular situation, he's sitting in the back of the McDonald's, so he's sitting against a wall. The way that the police officers are positioned, and the defense attorneys supported this in their motion with screen captures from the body camera videos that the police officers were wearing. They create this wall of police officers, and pretty quickly they grab the backpack that is, I believe it was on the floor next to him, and they put it on a table about 6 feet away behind this wall of police officers. So this creates two situations. One, the defense is arguing that a reasonable person wouldn't feel free to leave given the situation. What that does is it triggers the Miranda requirements. If a person is not free to leave and they are subjected to an interrogation, Miranda is required. In this circumstance, they didn't advise him of Miranda until about 20 minutes into the contact. And in fact, on one point in the body camera video, one of the officers asks, has he been Mirandized? We should Mirandize him. And they still don't. That's about 10 minutes in. They still don't read him Miranda. About 20 minutes in, they do read him Miranda. And at that point, he invokes his right to remain silent. It's important to note that when an individual invokes their right to remain silent, the state or the government is not allowed to use that as evidence of guilt. Person exercising their right, under the Constitution isn't evidence that a person's guilty. It's just evidence that a person's exercising their rights. So one of the defense arguments is that the statements that he made pre-Miranda, and they're actually arguing that statements from the date he was arrested till about 15 days later should not be admissible. That surprised me a little bit. But I think a court will likely view the situation as custodial. Asking an individual questions like your name, who are you, that's not necessarily an interrogation, establishing somebody's identity. Mm-hmm. But they do ask him questions about, have you been to New York? Where are you from? He presents a false identification. He gives them a fake name. He presents a fake ID. And about 20 minutes in, they determine that the identification that he's presented is not a real ID.
So, what does that mean? So, custodial meaning kind of routine, like they wouldn't have to Mirandize him until they start asking more of those questions?
Yeah. So Miranda requires two things. It requires custodial interrogation, meaning you have to be in custody and the police have to be asking you questions or posing, statements to you that are designed to elicit an incriminating response, meaning that they're saying things to you or they're doing things which are designed to get you to make admissions of committing a crime. I don't think anybody's going to dispute that the questions were designed to elicit an incriminating response. They were trying to get him to admit to committing crimes or at least pieces of committing a crime. The question that usually comes up in these cases was the situation custodial? Meaning, would a reasonable person, not necessarily this person, but would a reasonable person in that situation feel free to leave? With things like traffic stops, Courts have held that a traffic stop is not custodial because typically with a traffic stop, you're like, okay, I'm going to get pulled over. I'm going to be here for about 10 minutes. I'm either going to get a ticket or a warning, and then I'm going to leave. With this type of situation, it's a little more ambiguous with regards to how long it's going to take place, what the police intentions are. And there's body camera video footage that indicates that at one point, one of the police officers goes outside the McDonald's and tells another officer, I'm 100% sure this is the guy from the shooting in New York. So the police believed that he was the suspect that was being sought for the killing in New York. Would a reasonable person, though, believe they were free to leave? And the defense is posing that this wall of police officers that was blocking his ability to exit, he was subjected to 2 pat-down searches, and then later he was handcuffed. All of that kind of alludes to that. I think a judge will find that it was custodial, it was an interrogation, and therefore any statements made prior to Miranda are going to be subject to this exclusionary rule, meaning that they can't be used in court. Whether or not the court will allow subsequent statements to come in will depend on whether or not the court feels like any subsequent statements were made because he made the pre-Miranda statements, meaning that once the bell is rung, you can't unring it. So oftentimes, if the police can, get a subject to make a statement without Miranda, when Miranda should have been read, and then they read a Miranda and then get them to make the statement again, the judge could decide that that's not enough to fix it.
So what about the backpack? I mean, where does that come into play then?
So the backpack is kind of interesting because the law for the United States court in Arizona, which very closely follows federal law, if in U.S. District Court, so in the death penalty case that's been filed in the Southern District of New York, and if this case was in Arizona, it's likely that a judge would find that the search of the backpack was legal because it was a search incident to an arrest. What's interesting, though, is that both New York and Pennsylvania have stricter standards. So both in New York and Pennsylvania, not only does it have to be incident to an arrest, there has to be what's called exigency. So what that means is there has to be a danger that either one, the defendant can access in this case, the backpack and get a weapon from it, or that there's a risk that evidence could be destroyed by the defendant. In this case, because the police officers took the backpack, moved it behind this wall of police officers, it's very likely that the search of the backpack that was done at the McDonald's and then later, immediately afterwards, after he was arrested at the police station by another patrol officer, it's likely that a court's going to say that those searches were illegal. Now, the police can fix this. And the way that they can fix an illegal search is that they can get a search warrant. So if the police went to a judge, didn't use any of the illegally obtained evidence, so they can't go, hey, judge, we already looked in the backpack and here's what's in there, give us a search warrant. That wouldn't be enough to fix it. But if the police go to a judge and say, we arrested this individual, they had a backpack, this individual fits the description of the person who's alleged to have committed this murder, in New York, can we have a search warrant? But the police don't include any of the illegally obtained evidence in their search warrant. The search warrant could allow a legal subsequent search. So a search after the illegal search with the warrant could be legal.
So
So
they could
it could,
retroactively do this.
they can fix it.
I
So, and they
didn't know
can
that.
fix it by getting a search warrant that doesn't rely on the illegally obtained information.
And I mean, I suspect that would be the way that they would go if it was ruled that exigency. I've never heard that word before. That was a new word that I've learned.
Yeah, so exigency means that like there's an emergency, there's a situation that's time sensitive, and we have to act now. So, um, the example that was used, previously was that, we had to go and, the police are, knocking for a search warrant, on a house, and they're worried that, there's drugs and the drugs are going to get flushed down the toilet. That would be
Got
a
it.
situation where there could be destruction of evidence. So there could be exigency in that particular situation. In this situation, because the backpack was removed, and Mangione no longer had access to the backpack, there was no exigency. So under the law in Pennsylvania and New York, it's likely a court's going to say that those initial searches by the patrol officers were not legal.
Got it.
And
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
when I saw this, I my impression was this is amateur, that the police acted in a really amateur way. I think it's possible they were excited. This case is big news. I think we got the guy in this case. And it was all patrol officers who did this. It doesn't appear there were any detectives
Yeah.
involved in this. So I suspect they just got excited and did these searches before they should have. The smart police officers will wait and get a search warrant. Even in Arizona, where a search incident to an arrest would be allowed in this situation, smart police officers are still going to get a search warrant, especially because in this case, you have the backpack, but then you have containers inside the backpack. So there's evidence that the police opened up his journal. They read information from his journal. There was a package in the backpack that the police officers used a knife and cut open to see what was inside the package. All of those things, just a smart investigator is going to say, stop, let's go get a search warrant. And I think that given the circumstances, they could have gotten a search warrant. I have very little doubt that they would have been able to sit down and write an affidavit for a search warrant that would have convinced a judge, hey, give them a search warrant.
Right.
So I think I think they got excited. And I think they acted rashly when they should have taken a step back and thought about it a little bit and thought about the gravity of this case. And, a case this big is obviously going to get a lot of scrutiny. And, you can't make these kinds of mistakes when you're investigating a case like this.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we'll see what happens. Is there, we could find out this week. When do you expect this to go to trial? It's a huge case. When do you expect us to see this actually unfold in court? Obviously, federal would, there wouldn't be cameras, but state, there definitely could be.
So in one of the motions I read, the defense stated that the prosecutors had disclosed 7 terabytes of discovery. So to put that in perspective to people, I would say that your average laptop computer has a 500 gigabyte hard drive. So this would be enough discovery to completely fill the hard drive of 14 laptops. So that's a lot of stuff that has to be gone through. The New York court has already granted a motion so that Mr. Mangione can get a laptop of his own. That laptop is being prepared. They have to disable like the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth on any laptop that somebody who's in custody gets. And then the prosecutor is going to have to load the 7 terabytes of discovery onto an external hard drive because it's just too big to fit on any laptop. And he's going to need an opportunity to review it. The defense team is going to need an opportunity to review it. So when this New York State case goes to trial, I mean, it could be years. One of the things that the attorneys in the New York State case are trying to do is they're trying to get the state court judge to put a stay on the New York State case, to basically put the New York case on hold so that the federal case, which is a death penalty case, can go first.
And that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense in the order, but God, we'd be here for years and years, it seems like, honestly, before this would be fully adjudicated in both federal and state law.
If this case is going to go to trial, it will, and most death penalty cases do, unless the prosecutor is willing to back down on the death penalty. It will probably take years. I wouldn't be surprised if this case takes 3 years or more. We're already a year in. I wouldn't be surprised if it takes 2 or 3 more years just for, one of these cases to go to trial.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's probably good news to those who are supporting Luigi, that he's not going anywhere anytime soon and that he will be staying in the news headlines for several years. But there's just so much to it. I appreciate you coming on to kind of break down what we're looking at. I think it's confusing to people who are like, wait, but he was, this massive suspected killer. It was a huge hunt. Why would this be a problem? This was really damning evidence. So I think it's good to kind of break it down for people to understand what's really at stake and what could happen here. So I appreciate you doing that for us all the time. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have you on soon. Yeah, again, and obviously we'll be watching what happens with Luigi's case. So Russ, thank you so much. And we'll see you again soon. All right.
Have a good night.
You too. All right, guys, coming up next, there's a huge trial that's unfolding in Massachusetts, too. This is a really weird one. Talk about a marriage gone wrong, but there are some bizarre aspects to this case, even that happened right before opening statements. We'll get into the Brian Walsh and Ana Walshe murder trial coming up after the break. All right, segment 2 tonight on the docket. This is a trial. So I had heard a little bit about the Walsh family, Brian Walsh, husband, and his wife, Ana Walshe, who had gone missing in January of 2023. I think a lot of people had heard this because there were, moments in time where he wasn't charged with her murder and then he was. But this case is so strange. And I kind of want to break down what happened to get to the point this week where there was opening statements in the trial and what we've learned so far. So let's just talk about the case itself. Brian Walsh was a husband. He is on trial for the murder and dismemberment of his wife, Ana Walshe, who disappeared back in January of 2023. You can see them here on your screen together. Now, this is what happened back those 2, almost 3 years ago now, when she disappeared. Ana was last seen alive on January 1st, New Year's Day, in the morning, and her husband, Brian, then reported that she said she had a work emergency and had to go. Now, Ana was a real estate agent, mom of 3, and she split her time between living in Massachusetts with her family and then working also in Washington, D.C. But right before she went missing, Brian had found out she was having an affair with somebody. That person testified today in court. And so that became kind of this motive, like what was going wrong. They found so much evidence that Ana was killed. Her belongings were found. There was surveillance footage of Brian going to dumpsters around the area. Her COVID ID, like COVID-19 ID, was found. Her vaccine card, and so there was these bits of Ana that were found, but her actual remains were never found. Also going on at the same time, Brian had recently taken a $2.7 million life insurance policy out on Ana. He was named the sole beneficiary right before she disappeared. It feels like there is always a life insurance policy that's involved. And even weirder, just to throw in another bizarre aspect here, Brian had actually been convicted of art fraud. He was awaiting sentencing at the time that Ana disappeared for selling 2 fake Andy Warhol paintings. And so you can kind of see there was a lot of stress going on in their lives. He was convicted of this, awaiting sentencing, which there was going to likely be prison time for. Ana was having an affair, clearly not happy enough with Brian herself. They had a family to manage and take care of at the time. And then that's when Ana disappears. Of course, Brian said that he didn't have any involvement, nothing happened. But there's also internet search history here that is wild. We're going to get into that here in a second when we get into these opening statements and what happened this week. But unexpectedly, everything took a turn right before the trial started. Right before, Brian Walsh ended up pleading guilty, not to murder, but to illegally disposing a human body and misleading police. So now you have him admitting that he disposed of Ana's body, not admitting how, but admitting he did it, but not admitting to killing her. Well, how does that work? Basically, his defense team is saying that Ana was dead and he woke up in bed and saw that his wife was dead. And so he panicked and felt like he needed to clean up whatever had happened and get rid of the evidence so their kids would not see that she had died. Interesting approach. But we're going to get more into their likely reason for this defense and pleading guilty to just a couple of the charges, but not the murder charge. But let's start with the trial this week. The prosecution showed images of the dumpsters that Brian Walsh reportedly visited to dump Ana's remains. That's where they found her clothes, her boots, things like that. But these internet searches were possibly the most damning evidence, maybe besides the surveillance footage of him at the dumpsters. There were things that he searched on his computer and also his son's iPad. But one of the police investigators took the stand this week and testified about what exactly those internet searches were after Ana went missing. And they're interesting. Take a listen.
How to saw a body. Is it possible to clean DNA off a knife? www.murdermurdermurder.com/blog. Want to get away with murder? ? Use special detergent.
Okay, murdermurdermurder.com. Have not seen that one before. I've seen a lot of damning internet searches. That is a new one. But obviously he was looking into this. So that was on his own computer. But then we also heard a clip played in court where police are investigating him and interrogating him about a week after his wife disappeared about searches on his son's iPad that he would have made. And so they played a clip of this. It's audio only, but you'll see the writing here on your screen. And they're asking Brian about these other searches on the iPad and why he would have searched those things.
There is dozens of searches in that iPad on the morning of the 1st that ask how to dispose of a human body, how to get blood out of hardwood floors, how to dispose of a body in the trash, how to stop a body from decomposing. And how do you explain that?
I have no idea.
Who did that? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, just it all seems very guilty, of course, but not found guilty yet in a court of law for murder. Obviously, though, for disposing of the body. The evidence clearly here is pretty strong. I mean, they've got blood, just right there. You can see it there. They've got blood evidence here. They've got the surveillance footage. They've got these internet searches. They have a motive, they have a life insurance policy, they have an affair. I mean, this is kind of that case that just has every aspect that would lead to a possible, motive to kill somebody like that. The problem, though, is they are still missing Ana's remains. Those have never been found up until this day. And as it goes, no body homicide cases are really hard to prove in a court of law. There is a lot of evidence, but at the end of the day, if the body that, the person themselves hasn't been found, that can be really hard for the prosecution. So legal analyst Jennifer Roman believes that the defense team has come up with this strategy to keep Brian eligible for parole. That may explain why he pleaded guilty to those lesser charges, but not the murder charge. She thinks they actually have a plan here that would help him in a way because, I think they're looking at it as he's probably going to be convicted of something, but let's try to make it so that he could get out of prison at some point. And Jennifer explains why.
The prosecution evidence is strong, but they still do have the weakness of not having the actual body. And I think it's a really smart strategy, but also would give them the option or the opportunity to speak with the prosecution about reducing the murder charge to, say, a second-degree murder or maybe even a manslaughter charge, which would allow Brian Walsh to preserve the possibility of parole. On a second-degree murder charge, he could still be sentenced to life in prison. However, he would have the possibility of parole. On a first-degree murder conviction, he does not have the possibility of parole. So a life sentence is truly a life sentence.
You just explain really the whole defense strategy right there. Of course, we'll learn more as this trial unfolds. Today, the man who Ana was having an affair with actually took the stand. He said that they were starting to figure out what their future would look like together and how they would actually go about being together. And he did testify that Ana was very concerned about how she was going to tell Brian about this relationship and wanted to be the one to tell him so that he didn't find out another way. So there's a lot more to come in this trial. Will he be found guilty of murdering his wife too? Of course, we'll be following this from Arizona, even though it's happening in Massachusetts. A lot of eyes on this one as to who's going to take the stand and what they will prove or show in court next. Coming up, I think a lot of people are going to be tuning into Netflix. If you haven't already started it, the P. Diddy docuseries about everything that's happened is out. I watched all 4 episodes yesterday and this morning to be prepared to talk about it on the show. It is wild. We're going to talk about that in our last segment coming up after the break. All right, our final segment of the show tonight now playing. This is still one of my favorite segments where I get to talk about docuseries or documentaries that are coming out on streaming. Last week we got to talk about our own, but this week we're talking a Netflix docuseries that already is shot straight to the top 10, #1 on Netflix. We're talking about the new Sean Diddy Combs docuseries, The Reckoning, on Netflix. Obviously, a lot of people familiar and have been following that Diddy was in court this year facing a slew of different charges, including a RICO charge, sex trafficking, all of these different charges. He was only convicted of prostitution and sentenced to a 50-month sentence. And that was a much lesser charge than the other ones that he was looking at that potentially could have gotten him life in prison. But now we're looking at everything as he's still behind bars. This docuseries is wild. And this is the trailer you're watching right now. 50 Cent is the producer on this docuseries. It's a 4-part one, and it's almost 4 hours long because each of those episodes is about an hour. But gosh, they dive into everything from Diddy's childhood to how he grew up to how he started to get famous and what unfolded from there. One of the aspects that I thought was super interesting was they talk about Tupac and Biggie's deaths. And honestly, this documentary, it does stop short of accusing him, but it definitely makes you think about and come to the conclusion that there is a possibility that Diddy was involved in their deaths. And I thought that that was a fascinating angle, the way that they were able to talk about that. But what makes this documentary and docuseries interesting is that there is video of Diddy that he filmed himself. He was allegedly filming this documentary all about his life and everything like that. And I'm going to show everybody this. And so he was filming days before he was arrested in New York. And the filmmakers in this, including 50 Cent and his team, were able to obtain this footage that Diddy himself was filming and put it in the docuseries. And so when 50 Cent sat down with the director and the filmmaker in different interviews this past week, this was asked because they didn't know if Diddy's team and attorney's legal team actually knew that this footage was in this show. And so I want to play a clip here. 50 Cent and the filmmaker went on NBC and they were asked about this, if they knew, if Diddy's team knew that this footage had been used and was in this documentary. And 50 Cent has an interesting response.
Does he know y'all have this in the doc?
I would doubt he knows.
So when this airs, that'll be the first time that his legal team, Diddy, that everybody knows that this footage is now seeing the light of day.
Perhaps.
What was he intending to use it for?
I have no idea what he was doing that for.
I mean, you're talking about a man who films himself doing everything and has for decades. I think he wanted someone to be behind the scenes with him.
So his spokesperson came out and said that he had been filming himself for decades in an effort to chronicle his life for an eventual documentary. He was arrested back in September of 2024, and he was documenting that whole thing in an effort to also, eventually put it into some sort of film about himself. Now, interestingly enough, 50 Cent will not reveal the sources of where he got this footage. Diddy's legal team has already sent a cease and desist to Netflix and the filmmakers about this. And so we'll have to see how this all plays out. But I can tell you guys, this docuseries is worth the watch. They interview so many different people. And it's not just people who were accusing him of abuse or, fraud or anything like that. There's also 2 jurors from this past trial that are in this docuseries, and they're, fascinating. I will go out on a limb here and say that I think these 2 were a little bit starstruck, and that might have been the feeling that actually several of the jurors had in this trial. I would love to learn more from others. But there's also people who worked with Diddy for many years, personal assistants, producers, people who were very close to him, all of which had a really interesting kind of aspect to talk about how they felt like they either weren't paid either ever or very little for large involvement in his company and producing certain records. And I thought that their anecdotal stories were super fascinating. You even have a former personal assistant who talks about the fact that allegedly Diddy was going to murder Kid Cudi for sleeping with Cassie, his longtime girlfriend, who you've probably seen that video in the hotel of him beating her up. Cassie is a huge part of this docuseries. She is not interviewed in it, but she, it chronicles everything of their relationship when she was 19 years old that began, and for 10 years this went on. You probably heard, if you had been following the case and the trial, that they had these freak-offs. There was a man in this docuseries that identifies himself as a gigolo that he says was invited multiple times, flown across the country to be a part of Cassie and Diddy's sex activities. And it's just, the whole thing is so crazy. And when you watch it from start to finish, I felt really icky, just like about everything. It was just not good. And it seems like no matter what you think about the criminal charges and what Diddy was convicted of, that there were many people who felt they were severely wronged by him. bamboozled by him, manipulated by him. And it left me feeling like this guy is just awful. Like, there's, no matter what you think on the criminal side of things, clearly there were people who their lives were affected for many years. And watching some of these things play out in these affidavits and court documents and filings that they were also able to get, is pretty wild to watch that. So highly, highly suggest watching this. Sean Combs, The Reckoning. This is the everything about Diddy and what happened. 4-part docuseries out now on Netflix. I would love to hear your thoughts. And you can reach me on social media as well. I love to hear what you guys think about these segments, and if you're also watching these cases or these trials or these documentaries that come out too. So would love to hear from you guys. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in live. It was our first show back from Thanksgiving, so we're excited. Next week is my birthday, so I get to celebrate my birthday with you guys live. I'm excited about that, and it will be great. So I appreciate everybody. If you haven't already, follow True Crime AZ Live on Instagram and TikTok. We'll post segments from the show. Also, you can follow my YouTube, as well as I'll post these segments too, and shorter ones as well. Thanks to Russ Richelsoph, as always, for coming on with that legal analysis. Everybody have a great weekend, and we will see you next week for True Crime AZ Live. Good night.